All right, looks like we are good to go. Hi, folks, good evening. My name is Nishant Shah. I am a feminist, humanist, and a technologist, and I work as a professor of global media at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. It has been absolutely wonderful to be back at Transmediale in its full force, and just what a fantastic event this has been. I'm sure, like for many of you, like it has been with us. It seems to be like a reunion more than a festival this time, like meeting lots of people, and almost every conversation is beginning with, oh, last time I saw you on Zoom, and today we are meeting each other in person, and that's fantastic. I just want to kind of do a shout out to the incredible team of curators, technicians, workers, coordinators, directors, all these many, many logistical titles which have been going and working behind the scene to make all of this possible. Particularly just want to send a note of gratitude for sustaining this space where these conversations can happen and doing the invisible and the feminist labor of building the infrastructure that can keep these conversations going, which are around conditions of care, repair, and nurture. And I am particularly grateful to have this incredible opportunity for hosting this evening today with two of the most insightful, inspiring, and invigorating thinkers and practitioners in new media and digital cultures, Susan Schuppli and Wendy Kyong Chun. I think both Susan and Wendy possibly are two people I would say don't need an introduction, at least definitely not to this audience, because their work has become both the intellectual and political signposts for our collective research, scholarship, and practice, and their body of work stands as the critical resource that inspires global conversation around some of the more difficult questions of our digital times. And you know, if you want to find more about them, there is this wonderful little thing called Google, and you can do it. Or you can look at the Transmediale website. I'm just going to quickly signpost their professional affiliations. Susan Schuppli is a researcher and artist based in the UK, whose work examines material evidence from war and conflict to environmental disasters and climate change. Her work is focused on learning from ice and politics of cold, which might explain the temperature in this room. Wendy Chun is Simon Fraser University's Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media, a professor of communication and director of the Digital Democracies Institute. So it's my privilege tonight to set up the stage for Susan and Wendy to update us with their new research, knowledge, and analysis of the world under this strange title about how to know what to scale. It's a challenge to summarize the work of two such prolific researchers and practitioners, and sometimes difficult to figure out where to begin. It's perhaps equally difficult to try and set up a common stage trying to make the connections between the two of you about why you are both together on this particular panel. And because it's such a difficult question, I've decided not to answer it. Because I don't want to preempt their talks or even try to make sense of the questions of scale or algorithmic biases and the making and breaking of the world, which I'm sure both of them are going to take us through. And instead, I'm going to do something strange, but perhaps nice, is that I'm going to talk about what I have learned from Wendy and Susan's talks in the past and what I'm expecting today, because it's not so much in the content, but in how they approach the world that I think there is commonality. And I'm drawing out three components, which you don't know what I'm going to say now, so it's going to be a surprise. All right. But I think from both Wendy and Susan's work, one of the first component I want to point out is that the work is revelation. I think a lot of effort goes into persistently investing energies into revealing how the world is broken and breaking. but not merely through a litany of the ruptures, but through a fundamental analysis of the conditions that lead to its breaking. And their capacity for revealing that which is not known, but also showing the undercurrents of that which is known but habitually forgotten, is something that I am definitely excited by. Because their work doesn't just inform, but also reveals the way in which the world is made, and in this revelation shows the possibility of where it can be unmade and then remade. I think the second thing that I am always inspired by in both your work is that, well, to begin with, you are both a part of the curricula I teach, right? And every class, when we engage with your work, my students who are hungry for change and ready for action become energized to do something. Like there is this shift to make, to think, to do, to just really move. And I think both of you offer provocations which are not just hypothetical rhetoric, but actually a manifesto, a call for making an action into the world. So I often laugh and say to my friends that both of their names should actually be used as verbs, because their work moves us emotionally, intellectually, and viscerally to do something about the world that we find ourselves in. And I think the last component, which is also something that I think we've heard about this a lot in the last 3 days, is that both Wendy and Susan offer practices of repair, informed by feminist practices of care, resonant with the materiality of critical infrastructure, and offering historical readings that can be used to resist the foreclosure of future possibilities. I think both of you, sometimes explicitly but sometimes implicitly, perhaps build upon Eve Sedgwick's work of offering reparative readings of the world, and not just the paranoid ones. In their critique, our political strategies for making, repairing, maintaining, and persisting, which is also profoundly non-sexy and non-glamorous, but sometimes the most needed part of the work that we do. And I find it, persuasive that their work refuses the political fantasies of escape or neocolonial travels, and instead show us how to stand with our feet on the ground, creating conditions and resources for repair, and without despair. Because I think all of us have said this at some point or the other, that despair is the privilege of those who can afford it. And those people are not in this room. So I know that we're all going to be swept away into rich and complex worlds that think about the politics and refusals of scale in these two talks today. Both Wendy and Susan are going to present for about 30 minutes. And following that, we will be getting into a conversation with each other, but also from these participants in the physical space, but also those who are in the online space, to perhaps make sense of two things. One is how to know what to scale, but perhaps the second also is what to know when trying to scale. And I think both the talks are going to help us make sense of it. So will you please join me in welcoming Wendy and Susan for this panel today? And we begin with Wendy. We're all yours.
Great. So, sorry, I'm, well, you know. So I want to start by thanking Nishant for that really wonderful introduction, and for Nora and Elise and everyone for bringing us together today. Today, I want to think about how to know what to scale through sentiment, through the becoming technological of sentiment, through sentiment's organizational force. My talk today draws from and is inspired from work I'm doing with Kelly Dobson and Karina Albrecht on data visceralization, and an article that Grace Hong, Lisa Nakamura, and I have written in response to the really alarming rise of explicit anti-Asian racism, from mass killings to the 700% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes in cities like Vancouver, which is where I now live. But before I get there, I want to start with a seemingly banal question. How are you? Right? How are you? Have you ever thought about how weird it is that Americans start conversations with how are you, especially when they don't care and they don't want an answer. So the weirdness of this greeting really hit me when I was living in Lunenburg. So living in Germany, I found that these three little words, how are you, which was supposed to make conversation easy and light, did anything but, right? So strangers were just baffled. The checkout person at Edeka thought I was either crazy or American, which I think for her were about the same thing. But for my colleagues, I would ask them, how are you? And then they would proceed to tell me for 15 minutes how they were, what they ate, their relationship status, their nerves today. It was the most brutal thing. Now, how are you is often translated as "wie geht's." And here you see how "wie geht's" is explained to Americans. We're warned to be careful with "wie geht's." You can't just say "wie geht's" back, right? Doing so is confusing at best and rude at worst. Nonetheless, this site encourages us to take risks, to give it a try. Ask a German "wie geht's," and wishes us good luck, right? Now, although similar, "wie geht's" and "how are you" are different, right? So "wie geht's" asks for an objective reply. How goes it? It goes or it doesn't. Yes or no, right? How are you is all about you, your being, your sentiments, your subjectivity, right? At the same time, though, because we don't care, and we don't expect or want an answer, how are you presumes and fosters disaffection. It fosters disinterest and alienation. So it creates a distance between what's outside and inside, between what's latent and manifest. Or more cynically, it makes it so that you have something to hide, how you really are, as it seems to pry. So that breaking this conventional disaffection by showing you're real and authentic, by confessing, becomes defined as what's real. Okay, so this is strange, but strangely ordinary, because this is what I want us to think about tonight. This drive to know and not know grounds subjectivity on social media today. It's how you're measured and calculated. Social media creates and organizes spaces not by yelling, "Hey you," but rather through a constant and creepy, "How are you? What's on your mind?" Right? An organizational space of both disaffection and surveillance, linked to histories of occupation and capture, designed to pursue and foster an ever-elusive authenticity. So to unpack this, I turn to part one, bossware. Okay, so, sorry. So due to the pandemic, many of us started working and teaching remotely. How many of you like doing that? Right. I know I'm in Europe, yeah. So what began as an exception has become a North American norm. And according to Forbes magazine, remote work has become a permanent feature, not because corporations can save money, but rather because it's better for workers' mental health. It makes workers happier, and happier employees are more productive. So according to a work-from-home consulting company, employees that work from home are allegedly 20% more likely to work more than 40 hours a week, and nearly twice as likely, and almost 20% productive. So it would seem that work from home takes a machete to the work-life problem. More work, more life. But as you can see here, at the same time, work from home provokes a lot of anxiety. Pessimistic managers imagine their workers watching Netflix all day. So increasingly, corporations that are embracing work from home are also embracing bossware. And according to The Guardian, bossware is coming for almost every worker. But of course, us in US universities are at the vanguard of all this. And according to urban lore, Stanford professors were always told never to type anything into their computer that they didn't want the administration to know, because there was keystroke capture software on all university computers. But bossware isn't just about what you're doing. It's not just about logging keystrokes, taking screenshots, recording mouse movements, turning your cameras off and on, taking snapshots of you. It's not just about surveillance. It's also about prediction, about what you could do. Because bossware reads in everything and then uses sentiment analysis to assess your risk and to determine your risk level. And you're flagged as a potential risk if you have an extremely negative sentiment, or most importantly, if your sentiment seems to swing in a short period of time. Okay, but how do they know this, right? What's sentiment analysis? Sentiment analysis is basically a task of natural language processing, NLP, that extracts sentiments and opinions from texts. So it makes sentiments technological mediators. It's a form of emotional recognition, which, along with affective computing, is really driving the development of artificial intelligence. But most simply, what sentiment analysis does is determine whether a given text expresses a positive or negative sentiment, where sentiment is the expression of subjectivity as either a positive or negative opinion. So sentiment analysis entails 3 steps. The first step is to determine whether or not a text is subjective, right? So sentiment analysis is not about facts. It's not determining if something's true or false. It's all about subjectivity. Second is to determine the text polarity, so to determine if it's positive or negative. And the third step is to determine how intensely positive or negative it is. And it does this through either lexicon-based systems, and lexicon-based systems basically use dictionaries to determine the score of a sentiment, or through machine learning and massively labeled training sets. So for example, what sentiment analysis does is take a tweet like this and determine whether or not it's an opinion. Okay, so this is a different Wendy Chun. This is not me, who actually tests sentiment analysis on the web. You can find anything on Twitter, right? And one reason why this other Wendy Chun, who I've never met, but apparently lives in Florida, uses sentiment analysis on Twitter is because Twitter is considered to be a space only of sentiment, right? So in many ways, Twitter was made for sentiment analysis, and sentiment analysis was made for Twitter, right? So fundamentally, though, sentiment analysis, again, is about prediction, about predicting future sentiments based on past values. So the idea is, once you've trained a model based on their ground truth, and again, their ground truth or existing information is the angry tweeter, it can then take in any text and determine the sentiment of it. But the goal of sentiment analysis isn't just prediction, it's also behavioral change. Right? So corporations use sentiment analysis to best manage user complaints. And here you see, of course, that scandal of 2012 and the outrage that came out of it when people suddenly realized that Facebook was using sentiment analysis. Right? So this experiment in which people found that Facebook was giving certain people positive feeds and they became more positive, and people who got negative feeds got more negative ones. They apologized, but this apology and this outrage fundamentally misses the point. That this behavioral change, as Jerome Lanier and others have pointed out, is the product, right? The product isn't you. The product is this promise of a slight behavioral change. And this might seem really creepy, especially when it seems now to be applied to workers. But we have to realize that sentiment analysis, and especially sentiment analysis of workers, isn't new. Sentiment analysis has always been about monitoring and assessing workers to make them more productive, and not simply by openly surveilling them, but rather, and this is key, by making a state of absolute surveillance feel like freedom. By managing and producing hostility, disaffection, and cooperation. Where cooperation doesn't mean unionization, cooperation doesn't mean cooperation with workers, but cooperation with management, by constantly asking, how are you? Right? Because sentiment analysis begins at the beginning of the early 20th century with studies of women workers and with studies of Japanese American internees. Which brings me to part 2, illuminating cooperation. So for the sake of time, I've had to cut this section, but what it does is analyze a series of highly influential and controversial experiments that took place at Hawthorne Electric, Western Electric Company, just outside of Chicago between 1927 and 32. And these experiments were a collaboration between Western Electric and the Harvard Business School. So this is really where the idea of a Harvard Business School case comes. And so basically what they did was they segregated these 5 women for 5 years, constantly surveilled them, played with what they ate, gave them more to eat, less to eat, played with the temperature, etc., to see how these affected productivity. And the short story is that this experiment took 5 years because it was a complete failure. Because in the beginning, shorter hours made people more productive, right? But then they took everything away and these women were still productive. And so they tried to figure what made them more productive. And it couldn't just be that they were paid more because this was the Harvard Business School. So what they discovered was the importance of worker sentiment. Their great discovery was the behavior of workers couldn't be understood apart from their feelings or sentiments, that the meanings that people ascribed to their situation weren't logical but stemmed from their sentiments. And so the upshot of all of this, and this is where all the work on work-life balance and leisure comes in, is that management should talk to workers and consult with them about all changes before they do it. Because this would make and foster cooperation. And this has also become famous for what in the 1950s was called the Hawthorne effect. So this is well before Foucault, right? And the Hawthorne effect was the idea that subjects change their performance on a test in response to being observed. Now, there's a ton to say about this and no time, but what's important, what I want to plant in your brain is this thing that's become dogma in business schools almost didn't happen. But I can't go into this because what I want to spend some more time thinking about is how sentiment analysis, which emerged from analysis of workers, soon moved towards governing people in occupied territories. Which brings me to part 3, interning aliens. So during World War II, the US and Canada interned all Japanese nationals and Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians living on the west coast of their nations. They did not do the same for Germans or Italians. And the decision to intern all Japanese, regardless of their citizenship, was openly and blatantly and unapologetically racist. So it was linked to both racist beliefs in Oriental inscrutability. They had to put them all in camps because you couldn't tell them apart or know what they were thinking, as well as to the supposedly biological loyalty of the Japanese. And here you see what General John DeWitt, who oversaw the US internment, argued, right? So he said there's no way to determine their loyalty. It makes no difference whether or not he's an American citizen. He's still a Japanese. You needn't worry about Italians, except in certain cases, and as well as Germans, except in certain cases. But we must worry about the Japanese all the time until he's wiped off the map. More succinctly, he said, a Jap's a Jap. There's no way to tell the difference between the two. And if you look at this quotation, what's most insidious about the very bottom there is that the very fact there was no sabotage, was evidence that there was going to be sabotage, and therefore these people had to be interned. Now, this overtly racist and costly and ineffectual view was also countered by social scientists who used sentiment analysis. Social scientists who use sentiment analysis to pose as friends of Japanese Americans. So therefore, people who could really, through their studies, understand and be able to tell Orientals apart. Like they drew inspiration from Lawrence of Arabia in his work, right? So what they also saw with sentiment analysis was key not only to individuating these people, but also to managing not only these people, but other occupied territories after the war. And to make this point, I'll concentrate on the Bureau of Sociological Research run by psychiatrist Alexander Leighton at Poston. So Poston was one of the largest internment camps in the United States. And like many others, it was built, very poorly built, on what was then called Indian reservations. So this was in Colorado, and was managed both by the Office of Indian Affairs and the War Relocation Agency. And in these camps, which were supposed to be, to some extent, self-managed, Japanese Americans were encouraged to work. They were encouraged to work in order to become independent and gain self-respect and to prove their future usefulness as members of the American nation. Okay, but these camps weren't supposed to be like German work camps. And indeed, through their work, Japanese and Japanese Americans were supposed to show that the United States could carry out a program of evacuation and relocation in a democratic manner that would provide the greatest possible contrast to population shifts in Axis countries. But the importance of these camps wasn't just good PR for the United States. According to Leighton, understanding the camps would again be key to the United States' role after World War II. And in particular, the camps would be key to understanding and dealing with disintegrating communities. So communities they had disintegrated, in particular to understanding the administrative problems and supplying relief and rehabilitation. So these camps, like reservations in the minds of these administrators, were to be exceptional sites of democracy. Right? The goal of these camps was to democratize the enemy, as Brian Hayashi has pointed out, by literally, as Jody Bird has pointed out, transiting through the Indian. And these camps, like reservations, were also, and relatedly, sites of applied sociological research. So it was because the OIA was involved that Leighton was hired, because Leighton had previously worked with Navajo and Inuit communities. And Leighton's initial goals were to aid the administration by analyzing the attitudes of evacuees with particular reference to the responses to administrative acts and to draw practical conclusions as to what worked well, what didn't work so well, and why. And to gather data of a general character that might be of use to the administration of dislocated communities in occupied territories. But because things didn't go so well, and the Bureau of Sociological Research for a lot of the internees sounded like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they soon had to do three, which was train workers of Japanese ancestry in social analysis so they could be helpful in occupied areas in the Pacific during or after the war. So it basically became a training place for spies, both within the camp and later out in Japan and elsewhere. Now, to do this, they developed a 5-pronged system that almost exactly foreshadows what social media companies do today. Right? So the first step was general observation, right? Spread about the community in as many strategic spots as possible. Observe and record what people were saying in conversations around their homes, in their mess halls, in the shower rooms, in the doorsteps of the evening, in similar places. In each observation, it was considered desirable to note the following points. What were the sentiments expressed by word and action? What were the circumstances under which this occurred? What were the emotional tones and implications of the principal persons expressing and responding to the sentiments? What kinds of people were involved? What happened as a result? As part of the general observation, various meetings for political, social, religious, and recreational purposes were carefully described. The daily paper and other published materials were also scanned and notes were made on contents. So this is contemporary sentiment analysis, like Alexa meets text mining. The second was intensive interviews. This is what they developed from Western Electric, the collection of records. So as this name suggests, every record was analyzed and collected. Public opinion polls, so a lot of Gallup's techniques were optimized in these camps, and personality studies. So many years before Cambridge Analytica, the idea that what was key was building personality types. Now, although Poston was the first to have an applied sociological science division, soon these applied social science divisions became part of every camp. And it became so important because Poston didn't become that model democracy that somehow the administrators imagined that it would become. Right? It wasn't filled with these model minority Asians. In fact, what's really fascinating is Japanese Americans became model minorities. The term was first used and applied to them in a Time magazine article after World War II. And it was done in the context of, look, these people survived the internment camps and they're doing well. So what happened in these camps, though, is that these people became disaffected and angry. So if in the wild there was no action or sabotage, in the camps there were. And this was not only because these camps were really poorly built, right? So the internees called Poston 1, 2, and 3 Roastin', Toastin', and Dustin'. Also, the wages were really poor and not paid half the time. So half of the administrators were openly racist and said that this should be run like a concentration camp. But things broke down in November 1942 with a general strike in Poston 1. And this was actually led by some of the people who had initially supported the administrators. And this is how the Bureau of Sociological Research became so important, because the BSR was credited with turning this crisis into an opportunity. So they told the administrators that if the administrators negotiated carefully, it would come out of the situation with much better influence in the community than it had previously wielded. Whereas if it used force, there'd be violence, loss of life, and permanent alienation from hitherto cooperative residents, and a costly disruption of the community lasting many months. So the administration followed their advice, and within a few weeks, cooperation between the people and the governing body was markedly closer and more efficient than it had ever been. Right? And the BSR is so successful, according to Leighton, because it used sentiment analysis to shape the future. And here you see Leighton's diagram of sentiment analysis. So sentiment, analogous to the conditional reflexes studied in lower animals, non-humans, were key to successful social engineering under conditions of captivity and stress. So what this means is that at the heart of sentiment analysis lie women workers and Japanese American internees, and that they're central to current forms of social media analysis, manipulation, and research, to projections and mappings of social media subjectivities, and to those creepy friendships by which we help discern other people. So at the heart of all this lies disaffected groups of people, deliberately disrupted and reorganized into groups of affinity and racial likeness, constantly asked, "How are you?" Right? If this is so, and what's absolutely key, and what I want to end with, is that what we need to realize that what's read as authentic and real is anything but. No matter how literal sentiment analysis might try to be, it, like asking someone, "How are you?" always invokes a gap between what's inside and outside, latent and manifest, even as it seeks to overcome this gap. This gap never entirely disappears, even under conditions, and especially under conditions of disintegration, captivity, and stress. So consider this from Richard Nishimoto, who was a subject of a personality study on one of Leighton's disaffected researchers. So Nishimoto left this project because he hated Leighton. And then he joined one of the other 3 social science projects that were going on. And here's his personality study / autobiography. He starts with, "Well, Dr. Leighton, don't you think we better go in now? The overture of the second act has begun, you know. Oh yes, I know that you've been studying the personality traits of the lady standing over there, but don't you think you've been looking at her long enough? You've been glaring at her for the last 15 minutes, you know. Yes, I know she's beautiful, glamorous, and all that, but I think the leading character of the drama is more interesting." Nishimoto's engagement with himself and his colleagues as characters underscores the extent to which sentiment analysis provokes characters in drama, so that we're disaffected characters in a drama so poorly called big data. So here's a question to end with. Might an embrace of disaffected authenticity as disaffection, lead us elsewhere, even as disaffection and performance is the point rather than resistance? Thank you.
Sorry?
Do you need my laptop?
No?
Okay.
No, thanks. Yeah, and let me check my system preferences.
Sure.
So, audio out. Yeah, that's... Actually, I'll turn my Wi-Fi on. The audio out should be working.
Headphones.
Actually, I'm just going to put that there.
Videos work as well. Video works as well.
Yeah, we're fine. Oh, I think I've... sorry. Let me know when... Great. Well, good evening. While we get that sorted, just to say a warm thank you to Nora and Elise for the invitation to come and join you to join Wendy and Nishant today. I mean, I think it'll be I'm really looking forward to the discussion because this is going to be a significant jump cut in terms of the kind of content and areas for discussion, but I'm curious about how we can perhaps knit some of these ideas together. I'm not seeing anything yet. Sorry. Technical problem?
Yeah, they don't have a
Okay.
connection.
Maybe while that's being sorted, just to say my strategy, what I thought I would do would be to pull clips from different projects as a prompt for discussion, rather than trying to develop a kind of overarching argument. I'm just going to say, while they're trying to get things organized here, I'll just say a few words. So in thinking about the conceptual framework that has been put together for this transmediale, I was really trying to think about various projects in which a highly kind of localized and very specific environmental condition, often a situation of disaster or environmental pollutants, etc., how those kinds of localized situations are subject to technical infrastructures that capture information about what's happening on the ground. For example, remote sensing kind of platforms, could be a hydrophone sensor array that is lowered into a water body, but the ways in which, what is the relationship between very specific local conditions that are then mediated or observed by technological infrastructures that themselves are deeply complicit in the human, the ways in which human activities are altering the natural kind of world. Are we any closer? Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to start again because I've called my presentation Earth Evidence. The strange thing, I'm not seeing the bottom of my screen. Sorry, this is a bit weird.
We have a signal problem, so we're freezing every screen when you forward, and then we freeze, so we don't get the. If that's okay for you.
Okay, but I have a lot of transitions. Okay. Okay, enough. Anyway, I think it's more than appropriate in this particular context. Let me just jump ahead. So here are some examples of Landsat images. These are satellite images, and what we're looking at here is actually the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Here's another one. And this is a project from a number of years ago now, but once again, I said I'm going to approach the selection of these clips and snapshots, if you will, as prompts for discussion. And this one is a bit different than I'd say most of my work, because I was also trying to in some way stage a conceptual argument or an aesthetic and legal argument simultaneously. This is a very familiar event to many people, certainly one of the most significant oil spills in recent years. And like so many, this kind of real-time video footage of the gushing crude that was emanating out of the pipe. So this, you could watch this online, and many people, myself included, were sort of obsessively kind of watching this kind of like this gushing crude. But this is all to say that ultimately British Petroleum imposed a media ban, which meant that no helicopters, there was no access to journalists, et cetera, to actually access the site and document. What emerged out of that was an activist collective called Public Lab, whose work I think is really fantastic, and they do a lot of DIY community kind of satellite projects, and this image that they generously allowed me to work with this is one of their composite images that they produced, where they attached cameras to kites and balloons as a means of trying to circumvent this prohibition against the capture of the image of this growing kind of environmental kind of catastrophe. On the back wall of the gallery there is an animation that I produced, and one of the arguments I was trying to make with this piece, which is called Nature Represents Itself, was that despite the exertions of British Petroleum to really ban access and ban the capacity to visualize what was happening and thus manage the scale, and this was really, the media ban was a direct challenge to the scale of the disaster, and in order to minimize the scale, this media ban was imposed. Of course, as I said, Landsat satellites were nonetheless documenting, or let's say capturing data as to what was happening, but the spill itself was also expressing something about its own highly localized situation. That is to say, the interaction of hydrocarbons with water produced something that we call, or technically it's actually called an oil film, or scientifically, that is to say, because it's about the ways in which light refracts with water molecules and hydrocarbon atoms. So there's a way in which the spill itself, I was trying to argue, was producing an image despite all of the other kinds of attempts to basically censor any kind of like media production or media capture of that event. At the same time, the spill then becomes part of a very interesting legal strategy on behalf of Ecuador and the Pachamama Constitution, on behalf of the rights of nature. I'm just going to play a 2-minute composite. So if you had put on the headphones in the gallery, you would have heard this legal claim. So let me just play that now, and fingers crossed it works. So, okay, it's not working. What is happening?
Give me 1 second. Because
Can I,
video freezing.
can I,
Video with video freezing is not funny.
sorry?
A video with video freezing is not so funny, so.
Yeah. Yeah, you do what you need to do, that's fine. At least I'm not the source of this problem, which is, that's at least something. But I am gobbling up time, okay. Shall we give that a try?
Let's see what the technique says. Now it's working perfect.
Okay, thank you. I'm not hearing anything, though. I'm not. Okay. Ooh, weird. Okay, sorry. Maybe this is. Should I try? We'll try one more time. Yes. Great.
Quito, Ecuador, 26th of November 2010. The Honorable Secretary General Constitutional Court of Ecuador. Lawsuit on behalf of the rights of nature under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Under the principle of universal jurisdiction, we, Vandana Shiva, an Indian national, member of the Research Foundation for Science, Technology and Ecology, Ana Luz Valadez, a Mexican national, member of Desarrollo Alternativo, Diana Murcia, a Colombian national, member of the Instituto de Estudios Ecologistas del Tercer Mundo, Blanca Chancoso, a Quichua Ecuadorian national, member of Ecuarunari, Cecilia Cherres, Member and President of Acción Ecológica. Nimo Basi, a Nigerian national, member of the Oil Watch Network. Delfín Tenesaka, a Quechua Ecuadorian national, member and president of Ecuadunari. Alberto Acosta, an Ecuadorian national. And Líder Gongora, an Ecuadorian national, member and president of Sea Condemn, hereby submit, in defense of the rights of the sea, understood as an integral part of nature, which the Ecuadorian Constitution of 2008 recognizes as a subject of rights, and which we recognize as a giver of life, of which we form part, the present lawsuit filed under the principle of universal jurisdiction against the transnational corporation British Petroleum plc, headquartered in the United Kingdom, as the responsible party for the environmental disaster that struck the Gulf of Mexico on the 20th of April 2010.
And just apologies if you couldn't see that so well, but we're dimming the lights from here on in. What we have here is, this is a gamma camera inside the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactor after the accident, and this is a portable gamma camera that Toshiba invented specifically to try and visualize radiation in large open environments. And I'm going to play a short clip from a Japanese scientist who's actually using this gamma camera outside to try and localize the distribution of radioactive isotopes in an open air environment. And so let me just play that now. And you can turn those lights off again, that would be great, thank you.
8.8非常高いね。
One scientist involved in these investigations is Satoshi Mori. Mori and his team use a special camera that can show a visualization of the radiation dose. The areas with the highest levels appear in red. It's clear the amount of radiation near the ground is particularly high. Hotspots with exceptionally high levels of radiation are scattered throughout the forest.
So just to say, the use of the gamma camera and this particular kind of sensor is very different than the conventional Geiger counter that we might be familiar with, and it became one of the elements of a trilogy that I produced called Trace Evidence, which I'm not going to play this evening, but I wanted to just say that what's quite interesting, of course, is always remembering that the kinds of technical systems that are developed to sense these, let's say, a contaminated environment, we have to remember that these environments are already engaged in sensing and transmitting information about their own damaged condition. And the thinker, a former colleague, in fact, Jennifer Gabrys, in her book Program Earth, she calls this a data layer. And so the ways in which, say, ecological systems are producing a data layer that then becomes part of a kind of technical system that is capturing those kinds of changes, but then capturing that information, if you will, and that data layer is going to then be aggregated in innumerable other kinds of technical systems for the purposes of measurement, monitoring, and ultimately also, of course, modeling. So the ways in which it allows a kind of the ways in which these kinds of data layers basically enable shifts between different kinds of realities, from something that's happening on the ground, for example, to a highly kind of technological system operating, many kilometers up in the sort of lower Earth orbit. So I think it's important to be attentive to the ways in which environmental systems, materials, and all of the work that I've done around the material witness is really trying to make that argument about the ways in which materials themselves are expressing something of their kind of situation, and that information then combines with other kinds of modes of sensing observation, but doesn't have to be a technical system, of course, and can be and is often the daily lived experiences of communities, in particular affected communities that are very attentive to these kinds of changes. Nishant, I had a few technical issues, so I'm not sure where I am for time.
Take your time, I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to signal maybe this other, it was a project developed at this Cabao experimental site for atmospheric research. Actually, Rosa, who I'm sure is here, in fact, introduced me to the scientists that were working here, Rosa Menkamp. And I was commissioned to produce a 35 millimeter film that I called Atmospheric Feedback Loops, a vertical cinema project. I'll play just a couple of clips from this, and then we'll move on, basically. And just to say that this is not obvious. I've made these clips into a horizontal version just so it'll be a bit easier for us to watch in this sort of format. Can you bring the lights down? Thank you.
Noise is seen as a distortion. So we have thermal noise in the receiver itself, so that's the electrical noise generated by the instruments themselves. But we also have noise from the outside, so if you do a measurement, it's not only the cloud producing signal, it's also other things. A bird might produce a signal, an airplane might produce a signal. That's noise to us. When you talk about noise in this concept, so signal in comparison to noise, then noise is just something we don't want. On the other hand, if you do a pure measurement, then what you mainly measure is pure noise. Because if you look at the unprocessed data coming from the clouds, it's like noise. And we use our processing to get the signal, the data, out of this noise. Because it's hidden in there somewhere.
And in answer to this kind of like prompt around how it is that we know something and what it is that we know, I think something that has been always really important to me is sometimes it's called data proxies. So the ways in which we might find out something about ancient climactic, say, histories. But of course, we can look at cultural materials. What are the histories that are encoded or the histories that reside in poetry, in literature, in farmers' almanacs, etc. So when I was working with this and documenting the activities of this experimental atmospheric research center, this is at the very end of the film, and you'll hear the scientists talking about the ways in which they've actually had to look at art historical materials, that is to say paintings, to understand something of climactic conditions hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So let me play this short clip, which comes towards the very end.
A story is repeated here at Cabao. The artist Joseph Beuys once theorized that the unique atmospheric properties of light, which had inspired Dutch painters since the 17th century, had disappeared with the land reclamation projects of the 1950s. As post-war modernization began its terraforming operations throughout coastal regions of the Netherlands, the air was said to have lost its refractive shimmer due to the diminished number of water molecules carried inland by prevailing winds.
We use a painting from the 17th century landscape painter Jacob van Ruisdael. In fact, this is what he painted, the Dutch skies. Well, without knowing it, he recorded all the complex things about atmospheric research that we're studying.
So I'm going to jump a bit because I've got to manage my time a little bit better. So the kinds of sort of comments that the scientists are making there about looking at art historical paintings, that returns in a project that I'm still working with in India. And in order to get there, I wanted to just say, in order to talk about that, just to introduce the Learning from Ice project, which what we see in this image here, you don't have to turn the lights on. It'd actually be great if you could just keep them down. And I'm happy to talk in the dark, but because at least then you can see things more clearly. But just to say, those of you who may or may not be familiar, if you're not familiar with an ice core, and yeah, can you bring the lights down because it's really hard to see the detail in the ice core? Thank you. Perfect. I just wanted to highlight the ways in which an ice core, which is it's a sample this is a sample extracted from Antarctica. Myself, I've worked more within the context of the Arctic, and but we see the ways in which we can actually read that core we can actually read it quite visually, but we see the kind of layering of annual layers of precipitation and snowfall that slowly compress to form ice, and in compressing to form ice, they capture air, and then that air can be extracted and analyzed, and we can have a sense of what the actual material conditions of the atmosphere were up to 1 million years ago. But it's important to note that the fact that ice coring science enables us to make the claim that the planet has history. Yes, Earth has past, but it is these kinds of technical, let's say, technical interventions that turn something like ice into an epistemic object upon which we can make all sorts of claims, we can make policy statements, et cetera, et cetera. We need the invention of stratigraphy as well, of course, to understand the ways in which time is partitioned and organized in something like an ice core. So it's really important to, in some way, denaturalize these kinds of what I call Earth evidence. And this is a really kind of clear example here. For the sake of, I'm just going to show some images and maybe play a tiny clip for my last couple of minutes. And here we just see scientists cutting up this ice core, and then chunks of that will be sent to different kind of labs for various tests, etc. I'd like to jump ahead quickly. I'm just going to go here because I think this would be a good place to end. So I'm working with a group of grassroots organizations, but also scientists from IIT Indore in India, and we've been working on a project called Listening to Ice, and that involves the register of listening across many different kind of, or rather it involves listening across many different registers. So from this very technical sensor that sits in the bottom of that lake for 6 months at a time, capturing real-time data 24/7, to field recordings, to deep listening and listening workshops that we conducted with villagers from Aksha, which is the village that's closest to this glacier that's undergoing kind of dramatic change and is receding very kind of rapidly in the Himalayas. And this is another image from the village. We also met this wonderful elderly man who's been collecting folk songs throughout the region of Ladakh that record mountains, rivers, glaciers, and streams. we worked with him to translate those from Boti into Ladakian English and to produce a songbook that then went into schools throughout the region. We also ran a workshop. I can play this clip here where Murup is actually Murup is teaching and workshopping with the book and trying to sort of basically teach the songs and how to sing them and talk about the meaning for him. So it's really important that in projects that are trying to understand climate change and that are trying to understand climate change, but let's say environmental kind of changes more generally, is to really ask this question about where does knowledge about these kinds of changes reside. And as researchers working within, in my case, the cryosphere, that must involve working with affected communities and developing multiple kinds of strategies. And we really see the ways in which every strategy that one utilizes to maybe understand something about what's going on is operating at a different scale. And so I think in the work that I do, there's nothing I don't think there's the non-scalable is operating. It's rather about how all of these different scalar realities are working, sometimes at cross purposes, but how are they all working differently in order to produce a much more kind of complex understanding of our contemporary ecological conditions. So I think that's probably a good place to end so we can open up for conversation. And yeah, sorry, there's a few technical glitches, but I guess that happens fairly often in these kinds of scenarios. So thanks for your patience.
All right. Thank you so much, Wendy and Susan. I think in the list of knowing what not to scale, we need to add PowerPoint. Maybe PowerPoint should not scale, and we should basically be aware of it. Thank you so much for these conversations. I know there must be many bristling questions, both from the people in the audience here, but also people who are watching the live broadcast online. I'm actually so old, I don't say streaming, I say broadcast. And that happens. But while we are warming up, please start showing your hands, and please also know that we are almost blind and we can't see you, so like wave your hand so I can actually register that you have questions. But in the meantime, can I just start off, because Nora had charged me to make sense of how these two talks work together, and just offering as a very small reading that, Wendy, you deal a lot with models. And I think modeling is a particular kind of scalar practice because it's an inflated scalar practice. It takes up very small data and from there on creates like almost entire worldviews. And what I found fascinating, Susan, is that you work with maps and cartography, which is actually a descaling process, right? Because Borges had very famously told us that if we could make a map of the world to scale, it would have to be as large as the world itself. So it has to take like massive amounts of data and compress it into some ways. And then going back to the Transmedialis theme this time, so we've dealt with a model and a map. I'm wondering what role fiction plays in both of these spaces. And given my obsession with Korean soap operas, I can talk a lot about fiction, but I don't think this is the right spot for it. But I would love to just see, because Susan, you already ended with thinking through poetry and songs and folk songs and this fictive space through which you kind of create the atmospheric. And I think, Wendy, in some ways, if I were to open up that conversation, I think the fiction of democracy and what does democratization mean within that particular space of the Japanese-American internment camps is something that's perhaps worth exploring. So while we warm up, would you want to just think through the role of fiction and the place of fiction within the kind of scalar practices that both of you are dealing with?
Okay.
So I can go first. First of all, thank you, Nishant. You actually brought us together. And talk about scale. This is like made for people who are not my size. So I'm just going to sit here like this. Okay, so fiction is actually central and to sentiment analysis itself. Because one thing I've been thinking is that if sentiment analysis works, and this is a big if, the times that it does is when we're most fictional rather than least fictional. So the thing that, you know, the dudes from the Valley tell us is like they've hacked our unconscious and they can manipulate us like marionettes. But what's so fascinating about sentiment analysis, especially if you look at it carefully, and Pippa Adams, who just joined us as a postdoc in the Digital Democracies Institute, has done some fabulous analysis of manual analysis versus automatic analysis to show where sentiment analysis fails, is that if it works, it works because it's invoking various scripts that we participate in and that we validate or not through our interactions or our testing of it. So we can think of this in a few ways, especially thinking through fictions and the way forward with this. One thing I find fascinating is that people are talking more and more about the future of work being AI whisperers, right? So people who will give prompts to AIs, GPT language models, so that narrative will emerge, right? Which is a very scripted relationship. But what's interesting about that is that it's sentiment analysis in reverse, right? Where we're constantly asking ChatGPT-3, how are you? Right? Where we need to be trained in certain ways to understand how sentiment has been embedded in this and how we've been trained. And sentiment has been used in order to create these fictional and dramatic relationships. And so I think that thinking through the fictional and that gap is absolutely key. But again, where I hesitate to think of this as simply productive or forms of agency that somehow call into question sentiment analysis, is that the question that remains is, so what? You know, so what if they haven't hacked the unconscious, but we act in such a ways that they can predict certain forms of behavior? How can we understand these forms of agency that emerge within these highly scripted and captured scenarios and models, like our engagement with the model that makes it so?
I guess there would be a few different ways I would respond to that. Firstly, to say that, yes, the clip from the Netherlands, but of course also the songbook, working with Morup, these are cultural materials, and in those cultural materials, information of a certain kind resides. And so that would need to be, say, corroborated with other forms of, that's evidence, if we want to use that term. But fiction has been a really kind of very fertile area to find out information about environmental systems long before the invention of systems of measurement and instruments of measure. So that would be one. So the role of fiction, in some way, there, it has less to do with perhaps the beauty of prose, but rather the kind of information that something contains, or the kind of whatever, the sublime sort of like aesthetic kind of flourishes of a painter. It's really about how are they visualizing the clouds or something. So there's that role that fiction can play and does play in my work, and those forms of fiction are called data proxies. But then also there's the work of Isabel Stengers, who's been very important for me, and she made, like, she wrote something that has stayed with me for like probably 2 decades now, which is to say, to call something fiction isn't to say it's only just fiction, right? That fiction always carries something of the real, or fiction is a propositional state, and there's many examples where also, say, observations of a scientific kind might be just completely dismissed, or it doesn't have to be of a scientific kind, but we can think of many historic examples where claims are being dismissed, and they're being dismissed as kind of pure invention and fiction, and they later turn out to be kind of fact. So the valence of fiction as this kind of proposition that holds out promise for a different kind of set of, say, a different future, if you will. And then the third point I would make, I was chatting with the Odalith group last weekend, and we were talking about science fiction is so involved in world-making practices. And just to say that in the Center for Research Architecture, and Wendy, you were just there yesterday, in fact, which is where I work, and Wendy was a guest speaker. What we do very consistently is to ask ourselves, in what kind of world could something like this exist? Oftentimes in the work that we do, it's a human rights violation, or it can be an environmental infraction, but in what kind of world does this exist, and how do we understand that world, and what are all the component parts that come together, the conditions, et cetera, to bring something about? So in some way, that sort of world-making practice that we might identify with science fiction sort of is undone as an investigative kind of practice to understand how something came to be in the world. It didn't just happen. There were a lot of contributing kind of factors. So.
Thank you. That's a lovely expansion. I also think that perhaps the reason why fiction still is fascinating, not merely as a data set, data proxy, or even an information set, is because perhaps fiction allows to decreep. I think we need a new word. We have descale and degrowth. I think decreepiness, right? Because fiction allows you to ask the question not how are you, but it says how would you want to be, and that possibility of thinking how would you want to be has perhaps still some resonances of negotiation and agency, which is kind of embedded in it. And I just wanted to bring that back into that question.
Just a kind of, for me, definition of politics, isn't it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So Wendy Lee has written this brilliant book. Sorry, I don't know why my leg did that though. On sentiment and the novel, saying it's actually the prodding of sentiment which produced the novel. And the prude, sorry.
Do
you need some more water?
There's water here. Is there a, can you open that? Oh, there we go. Poor Wendy.
Oh, no.
Open that for her and then pass it to her.
She has a
Thank you.
bottle too.
Wow.
Yeah, just so that you all know, this was completely scripted. Like, that's why we're just sitting here saying, yeah, of course.
Oh, thank you. But basically, the prude is at the heart of the novel.
All right, to give you both some time to unwind, are there any questions, comments, things that people want to share from the audiences, physically or virtually? Okay, there's a huge hand there. There's somebody who's apparently called a vulture who's coming towards you. All right.
Hi, thank you both very much for this conversation, and solidarity with Wendy for her sore throat and losing her voice.
I think you gave it to me.
Sorry, Wendy. I'm better now, it gets better. But kind of better. One of the things that is really implicated in the conversation today is how we learn and how we study, and this is a kind of preoccupation of mine, the university disciplinarity. And I think the question, and it's fascinating that the two of you are in conversation with Nishant. I mean, you have like, as Susan is talking, I'm thinking Susan's basically a scientist. And you know, as Wendy's talking, I mean, you are a computer scientist and have a background in literature and study of media and culture. And so my question is really, if you had to advise somebody who was 18 years old today about how to bring a sort of critical politics within the sort of epistemic infrastructure of the university, the world that we live in now, to mount the kind of critiques that we need in the environments that we're living in the cultural spaces that we're living in, the datafied worlds that we're living in, what sort of combinations of skills and approaches do we need to the world of data and the digital? Thank you.
I mean, it's an amazing kind of question, and from my perspective, I think agile thinkers are key. Peer-to-peer learning, for me, is absolutely fundamental. And, Solveig was speaking earlier, and there was many of our former MAs are populating transmedially, and they know that we really work within a kind of non-hierarchical kind of space around the sort of round table, and it just changes the pedagogical scene. But like curiosity, a sense of compassion and care for others in your immediate context, but also it's maybe not 18-year-olds. I don't sort of deal so much with teenagers in the Center for Research Architecture, but it's about how everybody positions themselves in relationship to the work that they do and the areas of research interest, and actually is able to somehow account for that. It's not a kind of arbitrary move that somebody makes to really be able to somehow confront the stakes of what's at stake for them and what is at stake for the communities in which they may also be working or wish to work. But first and foremost, I always think like agility has to be there and an innate sense of kind of curiosity. Those to me are like, in some way, the most, and political commitment to a collective project, I guess. That's the sort of ways in which I might sort of want to characterize that.
No, we just had a workshop earlier this month. I'll tell you what I will take away from Transmediala this time, and this is an answer to your question maybe. I think 2 days ago, Heba Amin sat on the same stage, and in a panel, she refused to buy into an optimistic performance that one day the world will get better. And I think to the 18-year-old who enters that critical epistemological space, we need to start talking about, yes, the world is broken, but you will not despair. But it's also not automatically just going to become better. And so the new politics that is perhaps required is not politics of hope or despair, but of refusal and repair. And it's non-glamorous work, and it's not sexy, and it's not Instagrammable, but that's where we're going to have to do the work, right? Which is repair. And I think there's a lot of kind of feminist history in what repair could do and what would it mean. And I think that would be an interesting thing to give out to them in some way. Because at least my 18-year-olds, I deal with it. If I give them false utopias, they just roll their eyes and turn on their phones. Like, they have no buy into the idea that one day the world will be saved around. There's a question there.
Hi, I'm going to try to be an agile thinker, maybe with a bit of humor. In the previous session, someone brought up Andreas Malm's book about how to blow up a pipeline. And I think that could be useful in this scenario, because if we're looking at how data pipelines are abusing the power and wealth that they are amassing from what they're stealing from all of our productivity, then we need to really think seriously about like a simple map of where these people live, and how do we hold them accountable, and how do we destroy what they are amassing for data, which is almost like a hyper-Stasi-like kind of data bank on human populations. Come on, let's get serious.
I think that's a great comment. I don't know if you missed my introduction, but in 3 weeks, I'm going to relocate to Hong Kong. So for me, it's a hard pass on answering that question. But I will pass it on to somebody else to see how you want to reply to that.
I mean, do you want to, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many different ways of acting tactically, kind of politically, and I have to say that in the, let's say in the environment and context in which I work, which includes the work of forensic architecture, we're often working inside systems that are deeply compromised, and the work is about radicalizing what's possible within those contexts, and it involves actually getting up very, in some cases, very close to the thing that you're extremely critical of. So it's not a kind of direct answer to your question about the kind of the massive amounts of data that are utilized and mobilized. I live in the United Kingdom, and we see the ways in which, say, Cambridge Analytica and the Brexit debate unfolded. But just to say that, okay, there was, I mean, as an example, there was a kind of recognition of a group of people that were very disaffected and that constituted a sort of so-called untapped data set, and that and that was then targeted relentlessly through things like clickbait, et cetera, et cetera. But that was, of course, also that data that was produced, that in some way produced a kind of political picture of a whole group of people who had, say, never voted, and were going to be mobilized into voting for the first time. That was coupled with all kinds of other activities, such as the Murdoch news empire. It didn't function in a kind of silo. It was part of a larger set of campaigns that was very kind of, that was operating across all kinds of different technical systems, but systems of communication, but also in neighborhoods, in pubs, and through conversation, et cetera. It was sort of amplified and multiplied. And so, to me, we can't simply look at something, okay, here's the problem is with data and data banks and the acquiring of vast amounts of data. It's the ways in which all of these things are part of networks. And so any sort of strategy would somehow have to also do that analytical work, which I think is extremely hard to do. Obviously, one has to start sort of somewhere, but just to say, it was really clear in the case of the Brexit campaign, the ways in which, yeah, data was very operative in terms of, or is a data set was identified and acted upon, but that was then, as I said, was integrated into a whole set of kind of strategies, from very kind of vernacular to highly kind of technological sort of systems, yeah.
I'm so glad that you're bringing that up, because I think one of the things that's often missing in this idea of the political imaginary of data is the state.
Is what?
Is the state. Like, there's a lot of imagination about what the private corporations are doing and what their nexus are doing and so on. But if you or if you study countries like I do, for example, in India and some parts of East Asia, you realize that the larger political economy of data is not really the private sector, but actually the state, and how it is literally just fabricating fictions of what it is going to be based on the models of what the citizen is going to become as well. Right? So I think that interplay needs to be perhaps brought back more into conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree. And we can see it with, say, policing and prisons and the ways in which the asylum systems are working. They're state systems that have produced many different systems for acquiring data that are highly kind of integrated, but access to that information is completely withheld.
Yeah. Wendy, do you want to have some last words?
Maybe. But just very briefly, I think one way we can think about this is the right not to be captured, as opposed to the right to be forgotten.
Yeah. That's true. On the screen in front of me is like a red timer, but we've had a few technical hitches, so I'm going to see if we can extend it for one more question. If there's a hand over there. If you have a comment and you want to piggyback on it, this is also the moment to raise your hand, and we can at least get your voice heard and then talk about this later outside over a drink. But the person
I want to ask about ambiguity and the role of ambiguity, and also disambiguity as well. The way in which computation is always about disambiguating statements in order to break them down into computable actions or algorithms. But we come to a place like this, which is full of artists who often crave ambiguity, and it seems the ultimate contact point in why transmedial is so valuable, to be able to reimagine the epistemic in the relationship, in trying to create a new relationship between the ambiguity, the act of ambiguous creation and disambiguous computation. I wondered if you could comment a bit on that observation and whether it's true or not.
Is there anybody else in the audience who wants another kind of comment thrown into the pool? There is a hand here, and unfortunately that's going to be the last public question. And then I'll come to Wendy and Susan for some closing remarks and reflections on that. Please.
Hi. So as I understood, like part of this lecture was also about like deconstructing, data biases. And then I was wondering, like, where would you draw the line between like doubting data and, kind of being manipulated by it, or like the potential of like manipulating us and manipulating the data that's collected and so on, and like drawing the line with like, yes, like trusting science. And, like an example would be, I think, like maybe the development of the COVID vaccine, for instance, and how people who like wanted to doubt that process were pigeonholed into like specific groups. Like where you're like, oh, okay, we have to be doubtful of like manipulation, and then at some point being like, okay, no, but like science is the end all. Like I feel like there's still an overarching like trust in like, data collection, and actually both of you deal with data collection as well. But at the same time, you're saying that we have to be doubtful of it or like frame it as a fiction. So then I feel like there's kind of, just like paradoxical directions in this. I mean, not like as a judgment, but just like that's a thing that comes to my mind. Like, yeah.
Thank you. Wendy, do you want to go first, address one or both shortly, and then we'll go to Susan?
If I could bring them together, what I find fascinating is the way in which scientific inquiry is about ambiguity. It's driven by disagreement and uncertainty. And so what I find unproductive are the moments in which the claim is made that ambiguity has been cleared up in any field. And so, for instance, in sentiment analysis or natural language processing, there is that disambiguation in the taking down to those units. But those units themselves can't deal well with context. And this gets into some of the difficulties with sentiment analysis. There are also people such as Caroline Runningwolf working on natural language models for indigenous languages in which you can't have that disambiguation. And what I find, again, interesting about some of the attacks made against climate scientists were moments in which they were like, oh, we got you. Like, see, this email has a variable called makeup, or I forget what they called that variable. Never call your variable like cheating or something like that. Literally was called something like, let's make up for what's missing here. And that led to this moment of like, well, we got you. Rather than dealing with the complexity of these proxies, the complexity of the work that goes into reading and creating the science, not as something that makes it questionable, but precisely what makes it valuable. So my partner actually deals with NASA and a lot of the proxies that you're talking about. and dealing with the difficulty of tree rings, of NASA's radar readings, of everything, is something that has to be part of public conversation. So people don't say, oh, wow, there's a contradiction, you're wrong. But like, oh, wow, this is interesting.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't see where the first questioner, oh, okay, was there. Okay, sorry, I didn't see you. Yeah, how would I try and bring these together? Maybe there was something that emerged in the, and I'm talking a bit generally, but okay, let's say the scientists that I would speak with, work with, et cetera, primarily glaciologists, and from time to time, people who model ice sheets. But just to say that there was a kind of conversation that emerged that was really, I think, fascinating, which was about the data gap that COVID produced, because a lot of field scientists have instruments that are acquiring real-time data, or they're acquiring intermittent data every season, and a lot of today using obviously a lot of technological systems that are designed to run and to fill up a hard drive for a field season, and then one has to go, change batteries, download that data. COVID produced a massive data gap in the world of kind of climate science for those people who do field work. And it's obviously it's a huge problem, this gap. And it's also, one can easily imagine the ways in which that's also going to be perhaps mobilized once again whenever there's an information gap. You can see the ways in which that is then going to start to participate in a whole range of, let's say, once again, say climate denial kinds of conversations. But when they're trying to maintain as best as possible continuous records, because that is what the discipline has set up as is required in order to make certain kinds of claims. And then something like COVID intervenes and produces like a very significant epistemic problem for a whole set of disciplines that are organized precisely around their continuous kind of record keeping in order to make a claim that can then be, say, acted on or become part of environmental policy, et cetera. So maybe I shifted the discussion a little bit from ambiguity, but this data gap that's a consequence of a pandemic that has in some way very little to do with the world of glaciology, but is now completely entangled with it. So these two worlds have come together in some way that were perhaps before, it's not that they weren't thinkable, but one didn't necessarily think about the relationship of a pathogen or a virus or a pandemic to a scientist working on a remote glacier somewhere in the Zanskar region of Ladakh. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm severely running out of time, and 11 years ago when I came to Germany, I was told that I should not make Germans angry. Historically, that hasn't played out well. And so I don't want to make any more people angry because we're running out of time, but thank you so much for this conversation, running through technical glitches and coughs and so on. Thank you very much for your generous answers. And yeah, thank you very much. And now is the time to head out. Thank you.